Dr. Paul here. Against the Wind, Doctors in Science Under Fire is now coming to you weekly. For those busy weeks where you didn't get through the whole show, this highlight reel is going to satisfy your thirst for knowledge and give you the information that you really need. You're not going to want to miss this first segment that covers Dr. Bose Ravenel, scientist, doctor, and expert on COVID. Functional nutritionist Luke Yamaguchi, meticulous scientist when it comes to delving into the literature. We go into a deep dive into everything COVID. And you're not going to want to miss the interview I did with Karen Kane about her daughter. Heart-wrenching, touching, something you need to have seen if you missed it. And then, of course, in the news with Bernadette Pager of Informed Choice Washington, bringing you up to date on what you might have missed that's in the news. Dr. Paul here with another episode of From the Heart. What I'm thinking today is that balance, not denial, is what's key to well-being. When you go on television today, are you left with a sense of peace and calm, or do you end up having fear? Fear is actually so devastating to your immune system. It's devastating to your psyche, to your heart, to your soul. That's not a good place to be. If you can live in a place where you don't have fear, life looks different. Be open to perhaps exploring how to get there. And that's a piece that I think Against the Wind, Doctors in Science Under Fire, can offer you. Dr. Paul here. It is a privilege and an honor to introduce to you Bose Ravenel. He is a colleague of mine, fellow board-certified pediatrician. You've become an expert, really, about COVID and all things COVID. Like, how many hours have you put into studying this?
Who knows? I'm guessing 600 hours.
Wow.
PCR, it was discovered by Kerry Mullis. In 1993, he got a Nobel Prize for it. And he warned before his death, about a few months before the pandemic, ironically, that it was a multiplication technique. We're taking tiny strands of RNA or DNA material and multiplying exponentially. And he warned that it could and should never be used for diagnosis of anything, period. It does not detect the presence of viable virus. It detects fragments. It could be fragments of similar strands of RNA from other viruses, other coronaviruses. Nobody knows. But we know that even Dr. Fauci in a July video that I referenced in my slides has a segment where he says that given the usual amplification numbers or cycle numbers of running the exponential doubling and quadrupling and all that of the material and this technique, an average of 97% of positive tests with a PCR in asymptomatic people, think of all the schools that are screening all the students, are false positive. They do not have viable material. They're not infectious.
So what does that do to our death rate then? Because that's what you hear on the news, right? We've got all these cases. We've got all these deaths.
Yeah, well, Deborah Burks said point blank back in March or April, I have a slide of that as well, one of the early slides. She actually said that we are counting as deaths from COVID anyone who dies who has, quote, COVID. And keep in mind, she's referring to people who die from whatever they died. Could have been automobile accident. We've heard all these stories. Someone dies of terminal cancer, whatever. If a positive PCR was present, they then say they died from COVID, even though they probably died from the other condition. Right. So we have that factor. And then the documented reimbursement funds through the COVID relief funds that incentivize ER hospitals to code COVID. So we have there are these forces that create that.
Yeah. I mean, it just makes sense. If you're running a hospital and you've shut it down to make room for COVID, and then there's nobody in the hospital, which throughout the height of this in my town, I don't know what it was like in yours, I would go through the hospitals, see babies, and the hospitals were like ghost towns. So I'm thinking, how are they surviving? Well, the only way was to make a lot of COVID diagnoses, because then you get massive reimbursement relative to what you would have get from others. Did you see a similar thing where you are?
Yeah. Equally important within that context is that looking at all-cause mortality, the total number of deaths is the more objective number. Right. You're either alive or dead. And the data that the Hopkins newsletter showed that coincident with the dramatic increase in alleged deaths from COVID, Not only was there a dramatic decrease in deaths from influenza and other infections, but all the other causes of mortality, cancer, heart disease. And bear in mind, because of shutdowns, which is another subject, but because of the shutdowns and all the collateral damage, the number of cardiovascular and cancer deaths should have shot up, but they went markedly down, people getting less care and less testing and less treatment. So the whole thing doesn't make a bit of sense unless you realize that phenomenon of substitution.
So many people, they're just listening to the news, and it doesn't matter what channel you're on. Everybody's dying. It's so scary. So people are living in fear. But when you look at actual infection fatality rates, what did you find?
Yeah, well, that's the famous conflating of case fatality rate, CFR, and infection fatality rate, IFR. Early on, Dr. Fauci, within 1 week, he said that the mortality rate of COVID was, quote, 10 times that for influenza. But it turned out that he was conflating, and others had done the same thing. They were using case fatality rate for one, comparing with infection fatality rate for the other. Infection fatality rate obviously means the number of deaths per so many actual infections, including both sick people and also people who have evidence of positive tests. I mean, they have the virus, but they're not sick. Case fatality rates are only people who are sick. So when you it's like comparing apples and oranges and say that one's 10 times the other. If you take those numbers and you look at the flip side, which is what is the odds of survival,
right?
It's quite interesting. 0 to 19, survival is 99.997%. It goes right on down the age groups successively. 99.98%, 99.5% for those 50 to 60, and even in my age group, 70 and up, 94.6% survival likelihood. And these figures, bear in mind, that's absent early effective treatment, which can reduce the risk of death by 95%.
But with or without masks, should we be afraid?
Absolutely not. We know people who died from COVID. I believe that.
Yep.
However,
I do too.
It is no different. Fundamentally, it's essentially a maybe an average or a little above average flu season as far as actual deaths from the disease and the risk of dying from it.
Yeah.
It just happens to cluster more heavily among my age generation. But with effective early treatment, you can bring the risk down to it's negligible.
Let's shift over to the response that our country has had, in fact, most of the world, this shutdown quarantine response. What is your take on that?
Number one, you have the number of people who died from COVID, but the number who have died from the collateral damage from the measures to try to reduce the deaths from COVID far exceed deaths, suicides, drug addiction, economic disruption, loss of jobs, psychological, psychiatric, children. It's just an endless series of things.
Yeah.
The worst part of it is that the shutdowns and all, which have done all this, don't work. The majority of studies that the CDC will cite to claim to support the effects of the mask are theoretical. Yeah. They're like these projections, mathematical things, particle size. They're not real data on transmission. When you look at that, it's repeatedly shown that they do not do any good to slow spread, period. Yeah. And on the other side, there are about 9 different detrimental effects on the wearers that have been documented.
What have you found about treatments? Which things are most effective, in your opinion, from all your research? We are not giving medical advice on this show.
From what I have read, what people who report having used it, and people who've treated and those who've been treated, including doctors themselves who've been sick, what I keep hearing over and over is they got sick, they started taking hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin, the 2 main prescription ones, along with zinc, vitamin C, vitamin D, etc. And within days, they are markedly better. I know of about 4 different integrative practices, including Dr. Brownstein and others who've written about it and have written their data. They have had 100 patients all go to integrative practice, so they all have a chronic health problem. They wouldn't be going there in their 60s, 70s, some in the 80s, and not a single hospitalization or death. And these are all sick people.
There you go, folks. These mRNA vaccines, are they possibly affecting our DNA. So could this somehow cause ongoing harm?
It certainly could, and there's a plausible scientific reason why it might. There has been a documentation published of a natural infection with COVID actually apparently getting into the cells and altering the DNA.
Yeah, very concerning. What are your thoughts about genetic variants?
With regard to coronavirus, by May of 2020, I have an article. There were 40 variants identified by sequencing in Iceland alone. 40. And I've read another place where there are 149, and some say there are thousands. So it's almost beyond my comprehension to hear with a serious face people saying, oh, we've got variant this and variant that, and it's going to explode. And I mean, this is normal stuff.
So what is that? How does that inform us on the decision about using a vaccine?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it makes it highly likely that whatever, and they're already talking about making a booster already. So if you have 40 variants, you're going to have 40 boosters. I mean, it's ridiculous at some point.
Maybe you can share with our viewers. I'm imagining they're going, well, where am I going to get a prescription for ivermectin?
Great question. I called and got an appointment with America's frontline doctors.
Bose, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Okay. Thank you, Paul.
This team needs your support. This is a show that is completely funded by you, the viewers. We have no major sponsors. Right now, we're every other week. When the funds are there, we will go to weekly. And so become a member. Join now. We have a special $1.99 a month. That's less than a cup of coffee a month to get a whole slew of benefits. You're going to get for free my book that covers all the references in the vaccine-friendly plan. This is a massive undertaking. They're there for you. It's a very well done ebook. We've got another ebook that's a massive undertaking called Everyday Health. We're also going to start this next month a live Q&A for members only. And our team says thank you for your support. I'm Dr. Paul. Dr. Paul here. Welcome to our studio. It is a real privilege to have Karen Kane with me today. You lost your daughter's life in this fight to fight infectious diseases, right? So thank you for being willing to share your story. I know it's not an easy thing to do.
My daughter Lauren was born March 1994, and she was absolutely beautiful. Took her in at 6 weeks of age. She had one shot. She had the DPT live vaccine.
The whole cell.
Whole cell, which is really important because at that point they said that was totally fine. And she received that vaccine, and 2 hours later she had a 5-minute seizure.
Lauren Kane's seizures began 2 hours after her shot. The U.S. Vaccine Court said the vaccine was the cause. Her injuries were profound and eventually claimed her life.
Come on, you're okay. Come on, baby.
Let's preserve parental choice for vaccination.
Keep breathing. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Come on.
And I had never seen anything like that. I just got sick to my stomach, and I went back to the doctor that was really close down the street, Huntington Beach, California. This is 2 hours after the first seizure.
Okay.
So she had the shot, 2 hours, she had the seizure, and then 2 hours after that she had another very long seizure. And I went to the hospital. They kept her for a couple days, did all the CT, did the spinal.
Yeah, rule out sepsis, we called it.
Ruled out everything, and I'll never forget that hospital stay. My husband was out of town, her father was out of town, and they wake you up at like 5, 6 in the morning and to do blood draws.
Yep.
And it's just like her little tiny body, and I'm holding her, and you know, this is the right thing to do. And I just never knew on that day that it would become my life, you know, holding her down for so many different procedures. She didn't have another seizure for 14 days.
Okay.
And she had another one at home. Her father was there. We called 911. And she had long seizures. She had like 5-minute seizures and sometimes longer. And she's just still really tiny. And at that point, I think we started her on vitamin B because they said she could have a vitamin B deficiency.
Sometimes,
yes. That wasn't us. But we did blood work again. And then Labor Day weekend, June, I think, right? May, last weekend in May, she had 9 5-minute seizures in one day. She was a quadriplegic. She couldn't use her arms or her legs.
Wow.
She had a feeding tube.
Yeah.
She had a breathing tube.
Wow.
She had an extreme surgery where we severed her nose, pouched her nose and her mouth and her airway, and she only breathed out of her trach, which made her medically fragile because if you fall forward, you're going to suffocate. She had a vagal implant. I can go on. She had her hips replaced. She had
Oh
her
my goodness.
rod put in her
Been
spine. I
through
mean,
so much.
she was a train wreck physically,
Right.
spiritually. She was very, very powerful. But that's the whole part of it, isn't it? Our kids come in and they're vaccine injured and we're isolated, and you know, my whole life was torn apart. My marriage was quickly over. Coping
I'm sorry,
skills,
that's a common story.
very common, very common. And it was just a mess. And I was living in the hospital when she was 3. We lived in ICU, 171 days in ICU. And again, in the beginning, you know, that was back in the day. There's no internet, there's no connecting, there was no talking. We ended up finding out when she was just 3-4 months old about the vaccine injury compensation program,
Right.
which was really unlikely. But I'm super grateful for the doctor who pulled me aside and told me in a closet about it. And we ended up applying for that when she was a year old. And the government immediately agreed that Lauren was vaccine injured,
Yeah.
which never happens.
No, so you're one of the rare ones. But
Absolutely.
yours was one of those classic, that wholesale DPT was just we knew it was a bad vaccine. So I'm sorry that happened. That's just so tragic.
I know, with my little girl sitting in the wheelchair, you know, and she's all messed up, you know, her eyes are crooked, beautiful. Lauren was beautiful. She got away
yeah.
with a lot. But she was a train wreck physically. And people would just look at her and I say, well, she was vaccine injured and we settled with the government and they paid her medical bills for the rest of her life. And they just, for her life at that point when she was still alive. And people just looking just like, oh, that's not going to happen to me. And I feel that really profoundly now, especially with the COVID vaccine. People just don't think it's going to happen to them. And
you have nothing personally to gain by trying to share your story with the world, because vaccine injury is real, and yet we hear from the news anchors to the public health officials to the doctors in almost every office, vaccines are safe and effective. Well, that's a marketing slogan. That's not a fact. There is no such thing as a safe pharmaceutical. They all have some risk. It's all a matter of risk and benefit. And because they've never studied the vaccine program as a whole to see what the risks are, they simply don't know. Thank you for coming on our show. You've got a very important message and an amazing story. You're one of my heroes, and thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. I just so appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Saving lives.
Dr. Paul here. Welcome to our science segment. Luke Yamaguchi, good friend of mine. Thank you for coming. You are a scientist and a functional nutritionist. Let's start with the informed consent as pertains to COVID and the COVID-19 vaccines. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it helps to start with an understanding of the baseline risk of the disease itself. And so the interesting thing about COVID is that the risk is highly stratified by age. And that is to say that as we get older, the risk of dying from COVID increases.
Okay.
So to give you the numbers, 0 to 17 years old in the United States in 2020, there were 177 deaths involving influenza. This is the CDC's own data. Now for COVID-19, almost the same number, 179 deaths involving COVID-19 in the United States in 2020 for all children 0 to 17.
Right.
So that means that basically for this age group, children in the US, influenza and COVID-19, they're just as deadly. And so the reason why I start off with saying that and mentioning that is because I think there are probably some children out there and parents who have children, and maybe these kids are actually legitimately terrified and wondering if I get COVID-19, am I going to die?
Right.
And I just want them and their parents to know that at least last year in the US, if your kids aren't afraid of dying of influenza, they shouldn't be any more afraid of dying of COVID-19 because the deaths were basically the same. If we look at the overall infection fatality rate for all age groups for COVID-19, it's actually less than 1%. And we can compare that to, say, other historical infectious diseases of the past, like, say, smallpox, which is said to have had a 30% fatality rate, so maybe 30 times more deadly than COVID. And so I don't want to trivialize the severity of COVID, because obviously for older people with multiple
Right.
comorbidities, it is a serious
Yes.
and potentially very deadly disease.
Right.
But I also don't want to blow it out of proportion either.
Yeah.
To the extent where now, like little children who are at very little risk from the disease, the same risk that they'd be at as dying from influenza are now afraid that, oh my
Right.
God, if I get COVID-19, I might
Yeah.
die.
When you turn on the news, it's all about the vaccine.
Right.
Right. So give us your thoughts about that. There certainly must be risks and benefits.
I'll be speaking specifically about the mRNA ones. So
Okay.
this is Pfizer and Moderna's
Right.
mRNA COVID vaccines. And my understanding of that is that in the clinical trials, the people who received the COVID vaccine had a 95% reduced risk of developing symptomatic COVID compared to the placebo group. So it does seem that the vaccine is effective at preventing symptomatic COVID, but we don't know if the vaccine can prevent people from being infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's the virus that causes COVID-19.
Right.
And then perhaps be able to then go on to spread that virus to other people, even though they've
We don't
been
know if it'll prevent that
vaccinated.
either.
And so this is why Tony Fauci has been saying, and that, well, even after you get your vaccine, you still need to practice social distancing. You still need to wear a face mask or 2 face masks or whatever it is,
Right.
because we don't know if it will prevent infection and then being contagious and spreading that to other people. Yeah, so Peter Doshi wrote, he's an associate editor
Yeah.
of the BMJ, the British Medical Journal,
Right.
and he published something in October, I believe, of last year, where he was saying the clinical trials for the COVID vaccines were not not designed actually to assess the difference in severe outcomes like hospitalization,
Right.
intensive care use, and deaths.
Right.
So
So by design, they were not going to answer the question we really need.
they didn't
I
have
don't
the
think-
statistical power, I guess, is the problem.
Well, they weren't set up to go long enough to get the answers that we need.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Yeah, but yes, for that point in time. But I think as time moves forward, we'll get more data and we'll be
Yeah.
able to answer those questions a little bit better moving forward would be
Yeah.
my hope.
Hopefully. There's one problem. I'm reading, I don't know if it's happened yet, that both the Moderna and the Pfizer group are planning to vaccinate the control group
Right.
because it's unethical not to.
Right.
That ends the trial.
Yeah.
So then we won't ever get the data.
Right. So that's a problem. So we also don't know about the vaccine. How long is the duration of protection? Right? Because the
Right.
clinical trials have only been going on for
months.
however many months,
Yeah.
a few months or so. And we don't know how effective the vaccine will be at preventing the different variants and
Right.
mutations of the coronavirus now as well as in the future. It appears that these vaccines may actually be less efficacious against certain strains of the COVID virus, like
Right.
maybe the South American strain or other strains.
Yeah.
Another thing that we don't know is whether or not we'll need to get another COVID vaccine booster shot every year for the rest of our lives in order to be protected from this disease.
If it even protects us.
If it protects us. Now, just spoiler alert, but the CEO of Pfizer, I think, came out and said that's exactly what we're going to have to do. Is there's going to be an annual
Of course.
COVID vaccine booster shot, just like we have with the annual flu shot nowadays, and that's kind of what we're looking at in the future. Getting now to the risks, some of the risks of the vaccines, and I'll be speaking specifically about Moderna and Pfizer's mRNA COVID vaccines. So this technology, this messenger RNA technology, is a first of its kind
Right.
technology. It's never ever been deployed in a mass vaccination campaign in the history of the world ever.
Right.
It's not actually even formally approved by the FDA. It's just been given an authorization for emergency use. So in a very real way, it is an experimental vaccine because we just, as you pointed out earlier, don't have the long-term safety
Right.
data for it. It just
Right.
doesn't exist. We can't say for sure, like, oh, this isn't going to affect your fertility
Right.
5 or 10 years down the road.
We don't know.
We don't know. The
Right.
data just isn't there.
Or your autoimmunity.
Right. We just don't know.
Right.
We don't have the answer. We don't have the data to answer
Right.
that question. We see that there's been over 1,000 reported deaths. There's been hundreds of life-threatening adverse events, hundreds of cases of permanent disability, and thousands of hospitalizations and emergency room visits following COVID vaccination reported to this system, VAERS. The thing to note about VAERS is that the problem, one of its weaknesses, is it can't prove causation. It can only
Right.
show the temporal correlation, meaning they got the vaccine and then after this amount of time they had this adverse
Right.
event. But if we were to look at the clinical trial data of, say, Moderna's vaccine, it actually shows a pretty serious adverse reactions profile, or I should say a high percentage of adverse reactions. And so this is from the fact sheet of Moderna's own fact sheet. They say that 92% of participants who received Moderna's vaccine experienced pain at the injection site, 70% had fatigue, 65% had headache, 62% had muscle pain, 46% had joint pain, 45% had chills, 23% had nausea or vomiting, 16% had fever, and 15% had swelling at the injection site. And that's not even all of them. I didn't list all of them.
Those are all acute reactions. We haven't even looked at the chronic.
Right. So those are
Sign me up.
those are adverse reactions. So they're admitting that the vaccine caused those adverse reactions.
Wow. It's not an insignificant amount of adverse events. And this COVID-19 virus, especially with underlying conditions or if you're very old, it's a real deal. You want to optimize your immune system so you have a fighting chance.
Right.
What thoughts can you share with our viewers about what they can do?
So vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, quercetin, and melatonin are all things that you can think about considering. And in addition to that, I have one more that I want to mention. I've written a blog post on my website, which is gutresolution.com. It's iodine. You could probably just go and find an iodine mouthwash, like a mouthwash that contains iodine. And if you feel like you have a little bit of a sore throat coming on, maybe you came into contact with someone who's COVID positive and you want to like do something proactive, you could just kind of gargle this iodine rinse for maybe 30 seconds and then spit it out.
And our bodies need a certain amount of iodine. Do you know how the safety profile looks for use of iodine?
So dosage is very important with iodine. I would say work with your trusted healthcare practitioner to determine what dose of iodine is right for you. But as far as like using iodine as a gargle or mouth rinse or maybe even like a nasal spray or nasal rinse, you don't have to worry about that as long as you're not making your own using drops and doing it too much. So that's just one little tip that I want to leave people with.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Really good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Well, welcome to our In the News segment. Bernadette Pager is the Public Policy Director of Informed Choice Washington, a nonprofit dedicated to scientific integrity and public health policy, medical freedom, and informed consent. What I'm finding is that the data on the problems with vaccines is being minimized, and you're not hearing that data. We're going to get the latest VAERS data from you. I think you've looked at this, Bernadette. What are you finding?
There's so many reports being filed, and yet those reports do not represent all of the injuries. For the first time in the history of vaccination, second doses are packing a bigger wallop. And again, everybody is being told, oh, that just means your immune system working. These responses you're getting are not to your immune system fighting infection. It's not a reaction to the antibodies. That can't happen yet. That's later stage. You're reacting to the injection of the vaccine, of the lipid nanoparticle, of the part of it that your body considers to be a poison. And the fact that the second dose is escalating your response, that's very concerning. So the information VAERS is releasing is up to February 19th. So they're due to release a new one very soon, and a total of 19,907 reports altogether.
Right.
This is very much a concern.
That's substantial. And they've pulled vaccines for lesser amounts of side effects than this.
Yes. Yeah, far lesser. And it's very concerning. Everything is being whitewashed and excused, all these immune reactions.
And I've just had countless reports of people who've had terrible side effects and they're not able to report them. Everybody just calls them a coincidence. Oh, it wasn't the vaccine, it was a coincidence. So we have a system that's really not doing its job to get the truth out to you about what's actually happening for people who are being vaccinated. Tell me what your thoughts are, what you're reading, what are you seeing in the news about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
I think on average, I'm seeing 66% effective against preventing moderate to severe COVID-19. The span was from negative efficacy, meaning it increased your risk of COVID-19, to some positive, depending on the group and the situation. So Johnson & Johnson claimed that there were no fetal DNA fragments in their product. They're flat out lying, saying that it's not in the vaccine. And Dr. Teresa Deisher's work shows that there is the potential for autoimmune reactions and different things. One of the final concerns is that there was an adverse reaction in the clinical trial that shut down the trial for a while. They paused it.
I remember reading about that.
And when all the information was brought to the ACIP, they were asked 5 times to reveal what that adverse reaction was, and they refused.
Now, I think you have some more information. We've touched on ivermectin in the past. What's the new information?
Well, study after study around the world keeps showing how strong and effective ivermectin is for preventing infection. The data just shows that it gets introduced into a community and the numbers plummet. The case numbers, the hospitalization, and the fatality numbers just plummet. It's really amazing. And the COVID-19 critical care group, the FLCCC, they're called. They've got all the data on their website. They are fantastic. So I won't take a lot of time here. You can go explore the science.
Yeah, and these are not anti-vax doctors, folks.
No, not at all.
We have mainstream doctors coming together across this country with solutions to COVID. You need to look these folks up. We'll put a link at the bottom of this show so that you can have access to these folks. It's absolutely imperative that you understand it does matter where you get your information. So that's one of the real big reasons you need to subscribe to Against the Wind, Doctors in Science Under Fire. And, if you're hearing new information and you're skeptical, do your research. Absolutely do your research, because you might be amazed at what you find. So I look forward to running with you against the wind. Go to our website, doctorsinscience.com, sign up, donate if you can, and let's make this the weekly show the nation's been waiting for. I'm Dr. Paul.